Alright, so let's look at something. Let's look. What I'm going to do is just write sort of a generic trig equation. And what we're going to look at is, you know, we talk about mainly four things to graph with. Amplitude, period, phase shift, vertical shift. Okay. And normally, in all the problems that we had, I never gave you a graph that had both phase shift and vertical shift in it. Okay. No, I'm not. Okay. But we're going to write some equations that might have those. All right. Now, out of those four things, what I really want us to look at here is, you know, which ones can I just like look at and snap my fingers and tell you what they are, and what's the few of them that I have to do like computation. I have to figure it out. I just can't say. Okay? So let's look at this idea. Okay, we have plus or minus a. This is plain old sine curve. Sine b x plus c plus d. Okay. All right. So let's talk about let's talk about the idea of the stuff that I can just tell you off the top of my head versus the stuff that I have to figure out. Okay? So what can I figure out, like, be quiet. What can I figure out just by looking at those four things that we just talked about? Amplitude, okay, and vertical shift. Okay. If I look at an equation, I can tell those, right? Okay? So I'm just writing something right here. I can tell by looking. Okay? But what about the period? Okay. Right. So you have to say 2 pi divided by b. So the period is not just this number right there, is it? Okay? So the period is one thing that I just can't tell you what it is like that all the time. Sometimes we can. Okay? What's the other thing here that I just can't really tell? The phase shift. Okay? So the period, and we'll say PS the phase shift. So period and phase shift, I'm just going to say that here, that we can't tell just by looking. Sometimes we can, okay, but for the most part, we can't just look at it and tell what the phase shift is or what the period is, because we have to do some calculations on that number. Okay. Now, I just said this earlier, but let me say it again. What variable out of my A, B, C, and D? What variable helps me arrive at the period? The B. Okay. So that arrives at the period, the B variable. All right, what helps me arrive at the phase shift? The C, really it's the C and the V. All right, now I'll keep all those things in mind. Now what we're going to do is I'm going to give you the description of like a sine or a cosine curve, and we're going to figure out and see if we can write the equation for it. Okay, so let's do this. Let's write an equation for a cosine function. Oh my gosh. All right. With amplitude of, let's say, 3. And let's say we got a period of 10 pi. So I'm giving you kind of what the description of the graph looks like, right? I'm telling you what the period is, I'm telling you what the amplitude is, and what I want to see if we can figure out is can we write the equation? Okay. So let's do this. Notice what's not mentioned here. You have no vertical shift and no phase shift, right? Okay. So and we're talking about a cosine function, right? So let's just do this for right now. Let's do y equals plus or minus a obviously is cosine times bx. Now, that would fit that form, right? You kind of see what I'm saying? Because this form doesn't have vertical shift or phase shift. Okay? Now, out of these numbers here, this is what we just talked about right here. Go back just a second. Remember what was easy to look at and tell? What was easy not to look at and tell? Okay. The 3 or the 10 pi, which one can I just throw in the equation? 3, right? So y'all see how the 3 is just going to go in front of the cosine? Now here's the thing, and this is we really don't know the answer to this question. How do we know if that's going to be plus or minus 3? We don't, right? If we knew what the graph looked like, we would, right? Okay. So here's the idea. When we write the equation, to get an amplitude of 3, that could be a positive 3 or a negative 3 too. We wouldn't know unless we had a picture of the graph looking at us. Right? Now, so what about this? Y'all said a while ago that the b helps me figure out the period. So am I just going to throw that 10 pi in place of b right there? No. Okay. Right. The way that we calculate the period is 2 pi over b. So that's the real question on this problem, is what is the b value? Okay. So we have to figure it out. We just can't say 10 pi, can we? So when we're talking about period and phase shift, we're going to have to do some work. Okay, so really all it's going to amount to is just a little bit of algebra. Okay, let's go back to this formula and we'll figure out what the b is. All right, the formula for the period is 2 pi over b, right? Now think about, what are we really trying to find here? The b. Right? And so, don't I know what the period is? Right. All right. So if the period is 10 pi, can I put 10 pi in that little formula and figure out what b is by solving for it? So the period is 10 pi. We just don't know what b is. Okay. Now y'all see how we can solve for b there? You multiply by b on both sides. Okay. All right. What's a better way? Because you could look at it. Yeah, just cross multiply. Either way, it doesn't matter. Okay. So cross multiply or multiply both sides by b. So this would give me 10 pi b equals 2 pi. Okay. Then what would I do there? Yeah, divide by 10 pi on both sides. So notice the pi's would cancel, and 2/10 would be 1/5. Okay. So now that we know what that 1/5 is, we can write that equation. Okay. So we plus or minus 3 times the cosine. So what's our b there? And 1/5. So 1/5 times x. All right. That's it. So what I'm doing is I'm starting with the description and I'm trying to work backwards to get to it.
So we don't use any parentheses for phase shift or vertical shift?
No, because the problem didn't really say anything about a phase shift or a vertical shift. Okay. Now let's do this. Let's do an example now that has a vertical shift. Okay. All right. Time to make up one. Let's say that we've got a sine function. Let's say with amplitude of 2, okay, let's say period is 3 pi over 4, and vertical shift is 3. Okay. Now, do you remember the 2 of the 4 things that are easy? Amplitude and vertical shift, right? So, all right, you want amplitude? VS.
Oh, okay.
Vertical shift. Okay. All right. So let's see if we can start writing it. All right. So let's do y equals, because it's a function. You could say f of x if you want to there. Okay. Now, amplitude of 2, and it's a sine function. So help me write that. Plus or minus 2 sine x. Now let's talk about, it just says 2 there. It doesn't say plus or minus 2. But the amplitude is the absolute value. So that 2 in front could be positive or negative. There again, we don't know because we don't know what the graph really looks like. Okay? When we get the graph. So we'll do something in just a minute where we have pictures of graphs, and we'll be able to know by the picture of the graph. Now, so what's the next thing that usually comes up here? The bx. Okay. Now, can we just read that description and tell what the b is? No. It's not the period, is it? But they're connected, aren't they? The b and the period are connected. But I don't know what b is. I'm going to have to work to get it. Okay, what I'm saying? It's going to take some figuring out to figure out what b is. Now, the vertical shift is just 3. Can I just say plus 3 then? Yeah. All right. I mean, what I'm saying about vertical shift and amplitude? Vertical shift and amplitude, you just throw it on your equation. That's it. Okay? But now, I got to figure out the b. Let's figure out, what's that b? How do I figure out the b? What's going to help me find it? The period. Okay. The period is equal to 2 pi divided by b. Now, what are they telling me the period is? 3 pi over 4. So we have 3 pi over 4 equals 2 pi over b. Now, can we take that equation and just solve it now for b? And then we'll have the equation now. Okay? So we cross multiply again, and we'll get 3 pi b equals 8 pi. Okay, now what? Divide by 3 pi. It's basically going to be it. Okay. So pi's will cancel over there. So b is just going to be 8/3. Okay. So now, what do I need to do to my answer up there? Right. Put in what? 8/3 for b. Okay. So now my answer, plus or minus 2 times the sine of 8/3 x plus 3. Yeah. Okay. I used, this was the period, right? Okay. So basically what has to happen is we don't know what the b is, do we? It's not like the amplitude and the vertical shift where you just say it. Okay? But when it comes to what the value of the b is, you have to use the period. You have to use the formula for the period to find out what b is. So you're working backwards. Normally what do? We take that b value and we figure out what the period is and we graph it. Well, now we're taking out, we take what the period is and going backwards and figuring out the b. Okay? Now, let me do one more with you, or at least 2 more here. And let's throw in phase shift this time. Okay? Alright, this time, let's go back to a cosine function. Okay? So we got a cosine function, and let me give you like all kinds of stuff about it. Okay? And I'm just going to write it more in the list. Just say amplitude is 4. Period, let's say is 4 pi. Okay, now this time I'm going to throw in a phase shift at you. Okay, let's say phase shift pi over 4, and whatever running to. Now I'm going to do it with you. And then I'm going to let y'all maybe try something, alright? It'll write pi over 4. There we go. Alright. And then, say vertical shift is negative 3. Okay. Now, two out of 4 of those things, you just slap it on the equation, right? What can I just slap on there? Okay, amplitude and vertical shift, right? But period and phase shift, they don't go directly on the equation here. That's stuff that we have to figure out. Okay, so let's write what we know so far. Right, y equals, right, plus or minus 4 cosine. All right, now we're not going to know what the b or the c is, okay? But y'all think about it. What's going to help me find the b? The period. And then what's going to help me find the c? The phase shift. So the period is going to help me figure out the b. The phase shift is going to help me figure out the c. Okay? But we don't know them, do we? So right here we're just going to say bx plus c. Okay, so we're going to have to figure those things out and put them back in there. Now, vertical shift is -3. So can we just say -3 right there? Yeah. So one thing about these problems is nobody should miss those two numbers right there in there, should they? Vertical shift, amplitude, you just throw them on there. Now, but we've got to figure out what's the b variable, what's the c variable. So what's going to help me find the b variable is the period. Okay? Now, let's just start off with the generic formula. The period for the cosine function is 2 pi divided by b. Now, y'all help me fill that in. All right, the period is 4 pi, right? So 4 pi equals 2 pi over b. Now, y'all see how we can find the b now? We'll just cross multiply. So we'll get 4 pi b equals 2 pi. Right. Yep, that's going to be 1/2. Okay. So really it's just 2/4. And then 2/4 would reduce to 1/2. Okay, so we got the b. Right, now, this is a little new for us. We hadn't used a phase shift yet. Okay? So now we're going to use the phase shift to find out the value of the c. Okay? Now, start off with the equation kind of like that one. But what was the phase shift formula? Opposite of c over b. Okay? Now, let's fill that in, and then we'll figure it out. Okay? So the phase shift is pi over 4, right? We can do pi over 4 equals opposite of c. Now, that c is what we don't know, right? Over, yeah, what, 1/2, right? Because we know what b is, don't we? That's one thing about it. I couldn't have found c unless I found b first. Okay. Now, do we solve this one by, like, cross multiplying? No, I'm just going to cross multiply. Okay, now you could do it that way and, you know, kind of clean it up a little bit. But pi times 1/2 right there would just be pi over 2. So you get pi over 2 equals negative c times 4 would be negative 4c, right? Now there's a couple ways to approach it from here. You can divide both sides by -4, which that's the way I would do it. Okay? Or you could put negative 4c over 1 and cross multiply again. Okay, what do y'all want to do? Just want to divide both sides by -4? Yeah, that's really not that bad, is it? Since we've done this a lot. How do we do negative pi over 2 divided by -4? Just what, multiply by the reciprocal, right? Pi over 2 times negative 1/4. Okay? So that would give me negative pi over 8, right? Okay. Now what did I just find? That's the c. Okay? So now that I know c and b, all we got to do now is just throw those in there, right? Okay. So let's write out our answer. It's kind of weird that you got to go back to the top and write the answer that you did. All right, so what do we find out for b there? 1/2. So you can say 1/2 x. What's another way to write that? X over 2. Could you write 1/2 x?
Yeah.
Sure. Okay. So same thing. X over 2, 1/2 x. All right. And then plus c. So negative pi over 8. So it would be minus pi over 8. And then minus 3.
That's it.
That's it. Okay. Now. No, that's fine. Okay. So you can call it x over 2, or you can call it 1/2 x. It doesn't matter. Now. Yeah, now you should do that. So, don't say plus or negative, just say minus. Now, let's see if you guys can try the worksheet that I just gave you. I think try those first 6 problems there. Okay. All right, and I need to rush through a little bit so y'all cooperate with me, okay? All right, I gave you 3 graphs here to look at so you could do these along with me, okay? Now, let's figure out what kind of graph that I'm looking at first, okay? Now, here's the thing. All I need to look at is one period. I don't need to look at a lot of stuff on the graph, okay? And so, one of the things that you're really going to have to get past is you're going to have to know, how do I look at the graph and tell what the period is? Now, remember, the period is one complete cycle, right? Now, here's the thing. When I look at the graph, I only look at the y-axis and on over to the right, okay? So, on that first one, I'm not paying attention to any of this over here, okay? I'm only going to pay attention to this part over. Okay? Alright, it's calibrating my pins that way. Alright, so this part. Now, let's do this. On your graph here, what I want you to do, alright, go from the y-axis forward. And what we're going to have to do is figure out what's the period. Okay? Now, the period is where it makes a complete cycle, right? A complete cycle means it has to hit the middle, the high, and the low, and go back to where it starts. All right? So, this one is starting... Hang on just a second. Let me fix that. All right. So, let's start... There we go. Now, all right. Let's start at the origin. Now, what kind of a graph would start at the origin and go down? What kind of sign? A negative sign, okay? So we know it's going to be a negative sign graph. Okay? Now, so notice how far down does it go to? All right, to -5. So that should probably tell you that your amplitude is going to be 5. Okay? So I'm just kind of jotting down stuff that I realize. Okay? So my amplitude is probably going to be 5. Now, then it goes back up here. Now, has it made a complete cycle yet? No. So it went down from the middle point to the low point back to the middle point. Now, would it have made a complete cycle right here? No. It's been through all 3 points, right? But it has to go through all 3 points, but it has to go back to where it started, right? So, all right, what about right here?
Yeah.
That would be a complete cycle with me. Okay. So that's all the graph that I'm going to look at is just one period. So what is that value right there? 3 pi. So the period is 3 pi. Now, the directions are going to say that you're not going to have to worry about phase shift or vertical shift. Okay? Now, is this enough information to get the graph? Or the equation, I'm sorry. Okay? So it's going to be y equals -5. Now, we're not going to say plus or minus anymore. Because if it started at the origin and it went down, that means it had to be negative sign. So since we know what the graph looks like, we don't have to say plus or minus anymore. We can say whether it's going to be positive or negative. Okay? So negative 5 times the sine. Now, what are we going to say? 3 pi x? No. What are we going to have to figure out? What b is. Okay? What's going to help me figure out what b is? We just did this.
Setting 3 pi equal to 2 pi over b.
Right. The period formula of 2 pi over b. Okay? The period is equal to 2 pi over b. Now, you see how it was really important that we figured out what the period was? Okay? Alright, so we get 3 pi equals 2 pi over b, and now we're just going to solve that. So we get 3 pi b equals 2 pi. Divided by 3 pi on both sides, it's going to be 2/3. So b is 2/3. Okay? So now let's write our equation down. Y equals 5 sine of 2/3 x.
Okay, so how do you find the period is if you start from one point.
Start on the y-axis. Always start on the y-axis when you find the period, okay? And then just figure out how long is it taking to make a complete cycle. Okay, let's look at the next frame. Not always.
What if it's a
Because
cosine?
notice, that was only 3 units over what? So they're not always going to be counting by an appropriate unit like we did.
So do you count the origin as
The middle. So you're looking for to hit the middle, to hit the low, to hit the high, and go back to where it started. Okay?
Since there's 3 dots, that means that there's 3 units, right? Then so where
Gotta move the graph.
All right, go back. It started here, right? Now, y'all said right here that it hadn't made a complete cycle, did it? Because it hadn't went to the high point, has it? Okay? When it got to here, it still hasn't made a complete cycle because it hasn't hit the high point. Now, right here, it hit the high point there, right? So how come I can't say that the full period stopped right there? Because it's got to go back to where it started, which was the x-axis. All right, we're going to watch the next one, okay?
Well, what if it's a cosine graph instead of a sine graph?
All right, we'll look at the one like that. It's good. Okay? Now, so y'all kind of get the big idea, really, to get the equation, you really have to look at the graph and figure out what the period is. Okay? Now, let's start with this one. And notice, I'm not going to pay attention to this over here, am I? I'm just going to start at the y-axis. Now, since this one's starting at the origin, that would be a sine curve, wouldn't it? Right? Would it be a positive or negative sine curve? Positive. Right. What do you notice about the amplitude? Be 5 again. All right, now watch. So I'm going to start right here. Now, this is obvious, but have I made a complete cycle right here? No. All right. Now, I get back down to where I started. How come I hadn't made a complete cycle right there? I hadn't got the low point. Okay. Now, once I get down here, I've got the low point, right? How come I hadn't made the cycle yet? Got to go back to where you start. So, right here, would that be one period? Okay. So notice, I don't need to pay attention to anything else on the graph. All I have to do is just look at one cycle past the y-axis. Now, what value is that right there?
Oh, I don't know what you're saying.
Well, look, that says 1, that says 3,
Oh, I didn't know.
so that's got to be 2.
Okay.
Okay. So, now, if we know what the period is, and we know what kind of graph it is, we know it's a sine graph, right? And we know what the amplitude is, right? So we could write the equation to it. So when we look at the graph and write the equation, it's really all about trying to figure out what's the period. Okay, let's look at the third graph that I gave. We'll do a cosine off the worksheet. Okay. Now, this one's another sine graph. Now notice it's going down, so that one would be a negative sine graph. Okay. Now, and notice, I'm not looking at this, am I? Only from the y-axis over, okay? So, I'm going to draw, y'all tell me when I've made a complete cycle. right there, right up there, no, there, right? So the period for that one would be pi, right? Now, let's look on your worksheet and do a cosine, okay? So on your worksheet there, y'all tell me,
61.
61 is a cosine graph?
You want one?
Yeah. Hang on just a second. That's all right. All right. So number 61 is definitely a cosine graph, isn't it? Would it be a positive or negative?
It's going to be a cloud.
Positive, because it's starting up at positive 3 instead of negative 3. By the way, the amplitude there is what? 3. Okay. So now, all right, where do I need to start at? Over here? Right here, right? Okay. So, all right, is that a complete cycle? All right. What about that?
Yeah. But you already got to the top
All
of
right.
it.
It's hit all three. It's hit all three parts, but it has to go back to where it starts. So it's got to hit the high, the low, the in between, and go back to where it starts. So the period would be 4 pi. Okay. All right. Y'all finish up. Finish the worksheet. Finish the review. Okay. Now y'all can have it.